Thank you. I have, as is pretty common to me, as some of you know, more slides than I can easily get through, so certain parts of this may be rushing along to get to the punchline. The title of the talk is The Fractal Forest, an Archaeology of Body and Built Environment in Amazonia. By fractal, I should give, it will become more clear as the presentation goes what I mean by that, but what I don't mean by that is fractal in the formal sense of complex adaptive systems. I use fractal as a metaphor for scale and perspective as they are associated with the social lives of indigenous people and their indigenous forests in the Amazon. When I think of the social lives of forests, I think of the constructed hybrid and agentful nature of social construction, the construction of the forest. And so therefore, in constructing a history of the Amazonian environment, from an anthropological point of view, we are predisposed to construct an ethnographic history. And so while I'll be covering several different areas of the Amazon to help resonate with some of the other papers, this is primarily a story about an indigenous group that lives in the southern Amazon, the Upper Xingu, over the past 1,000 years. Most people have a pretty good idea of what the Amazon is. Much of it is probably wrong. One of the things that most people don't think of when they think of the Amazon and Amazonian histories is lost or hidden civilizations. This is Cahokia, the largest North American site. And for the longest time, the only people that seemed to have some idea that there was lost cities in the Amazon were perhaps somewhat off in their feelings. What they were looking for, and I won't read this entire thing, Percy Harrison Fawcett, who apparently was one of the inspirations for Indiana Jones, certainly the title of his work on Looking for the Lost City of Z could easily be a subtitle for an Indiana Jones film. In fact, you may see Brad Pitt in that role soon. It was also the inspiration for Conan Doyle's Lost Worlds. He was looking for Atlantis in the Amazon, and you can see, I'll just run through quickly, a monolithic in character, more ancient than Egypt, alphabetic writing, a valley surmounted by mountains. On an eminence in the middle of it was barreled roadway of stone, a pyramidal temple, domesticated animals, mines, and the like. In fact, this comes almost word for word out of the description of Atlantis. By the mid-20th century, this was 1925 when Fawcett was lost in the Upper Xingu region. By the mid-century, scientific anthropology or anthropology had come to the conclusion that the history of Amazonia was relatively flat and shallow compared to other areas, and they came up with this evolutionary cum geographic distribution of South American societies from marginal groups largely without agriculture, tropical forest tribes, circum-Caribbean chiefdoms, and Andean civilization. And as far as the tropical forest tribe, there is very little cultural variation across the region, or what I affectionately call the one-size-fits-all Amazonian Indian. That viewpoint eroded in the 1970s as people recognized from early ethnohistoric documents that there was major populations along the so-called, got to get my little pointer, the so-called Varzea, which is the bottomlands surrounding the Amazon and its primary tributaries that have rich alluvial sediments. This is a project that was initiated by Eduardo Neves, Jim Peterson, and I in the 1990s. Eduardo's been conducting massive work there. This is one of the type sites of Amazonian dark earths, as it were, our contemporary understanding of them. This is actually Munsell color black earth. This is the center of one of the largest sites, Asatuba. This is a plaza that is not quite as large as the plaza at Cahokia, but it is 4 football fields in size. That is, I believe, Eduardo right there, to give you some idea of the scale of this settlement. We've done significant excavations. Eduardo has now found multiple other sites and excavated. There may not have been millions of people here, but there was millions of pots. We know that with statistical certainty. And one thing we can say for sure, small tropical forest villages did not make millions of pots. We don't know what the actual population numbers are, but we can say for relatively certain they're significantly larger than what we see in contemporary times. Here's just a description of or a model of how terra preta may form. This is the village in the upper Xingu where I live. And you can see the black, dark earth around the mid. And I just threw this in here to resonate a little bit so that someone may have a better idea of what the Amazonian dark earths look like that are now appearing in Africa and elsewhere. Some of these polities, these complex societies in Amazonia, were not massive regional polities. Some of them were quite small, such as Marajó Island, where we see a regional organization. There's a hierarchical organization in these societies, but they probably just had a few thousand people. This is a new map of kind of our changing sensibilities about the Amazon, which includes numerous different regions of complex societies. And in each one of these regions, there's significant variation and variation between the regions. One of the things that's fascinating about the Amazonian complex societies that the best that we can tell, the ones in green are multi-ethnic societies. They were regional societies, but they were plural societies. It's not just one evolving society, one language. There was multiple languages and multiple social groups integrated in these polities. It's a very interesting thing about Amazonian variability. I'm going to talk more specifically about work that I've been doing here in the Xingu. You'll hear from Clark Erickson later about his work in Baudés and Mojos area of Bolivia. This is a culturally related group of societies in the southern Amazon. This was at one time, at least in the Xingu, an area where you headwater forested basins that you can see very clearly here. There's a very clear relationship between culture and nature, making it once again difficult to easily separate the two. The Xinguanos, when they were first encountered in the 1880s by Carl von Steinen, he referred to them as Naturvölkern, nature folk. They seemed to fit perfectly the model that people had of your basic tropical forest group. In fact, it says that they were primitive even by Amazonian standards. This is when they enter the popular English-speaking imagination in 1948 in Life magazine. And sure enough, that imagery continues in the popular imagination. The important relationship between science and society in understanding the sociality or humanity of tropical forests. I guarantee you that most of my undergraduate students are more likely to see this Rolling Stone expose than they are my science article, where, once again, we see very clearly a way of life unchanged since the dawn of time. I was surprised when I went through this article that there is my adopted brother and the Kwikudu chief, Afukaka Kwikudu, in the area that we seem to, over the past 20 years, been coming up with some pretty clear evidence that indeed a lot has changed over the past 500 years and 500 years before that. Here's what Sebastião Salgado had to say of these folks. He did these marvelous pictures. In the beginning, we were all like them, with remarkable echoing of some earlier descriptions of the New World. I just want to point out in Sebastião's lovely photograph, those are actually motorboats. But they do look good. This is the chronology that we've been able to develop over the past 15 or so years, and we see various periods and various eventful moments in their history, no less or more so than we would expect anywhere in Amazonia or anywhere in the world for that matter. One of the most recent episodes is what Susanna and Charles have called the Arc of Deforestation. Here it is in all its glory. I borrowed this from Scott Wallace's National Geographic article, but this yellow is the deforestation along the southern edges of the Amazon. This is actually the most threatened macroecological province of Amazonia. It's not like the open and closed broadleaf forests of the lowland Amazon, and it's certainly not like the Cerrado. It's a unique form of tropical forest vegetation, and surprisingly enough, those large settled population aggregates that I talked about are located in this area. So it turns out that when you cut down the forest and take that out of there, the yellow that you see, and you're left essentially just with indigenous areas, those indigenous areas are extremely anthropogenic landscapes. Here is an area where the mission of conservation has to change substantially to be able to address these areas. Ecological resiliency, biodiversity, other things, sustainability, as have been mentioned before, are very different in extremely or acutely anthropogenic regions than they are in natural forest. Just to give you some idea of how that change has happened in recent times, this is the difference between when I first started going in the area in 91 and 92 and now in 2004. It has become an island. This entire area was tropical forest, and now it isn't. And this is marvelously described in Susanna and Charles' article, How the Brazilian Outfarmed the American Farmer, related to the soy frontier. This is by and large related to the expansion of soy agriculture into this area over the past decade. As we move into this island of tropical forest, we start to see that there's a very different history than what we might expect. The boundary between the soy fields and the indigenous park today is like a great wall. It's like driving through the gates of Jurassic Park. You feel like you're going back in time into some primordial space, some primordial landscape. But actually, when you get in there, you start to see, well, there's constructions all over the place, such as this massive prehistoric ditch that now leads out into about a 300-meter-long fish weir that the contemporary people use today. One of the things that we find, we've, as I say, been working here for a couple decades, doing archaeological survey as well as ethnoarchaeology with the living communities and excavations at the major sites, is where there was one Kwikudu village that I lived in 1993, and many times afterwards, there was multiple PreColumbian villages. And they were organized into two regionally hierarchical clusters, each of which had kind of a center site and then secondary satellites and tertiary settlements around them. You can draw lines around these, what I call polities, based on the distribution of the third level or tertiary satellites. This is what one of the larger villages would have looked like. You can see it's identical in basic form to the contemporary village, including the orientation of roads by cardinal direction, the ring of houses, the major central plaza. Only in prehistoric times, the residential areas were about 10 to 15 times as large. Now, once again, you have to multiply that by the fact there was multiple of these villages in the place where there's one contemporary Kwikudu village today. This is what the forest looks like and related to these. This is kind of the opposite of the forest islands. In fact, here, the islands of greatest anthropogenicity are kind of scrub forest or even wooded savannas that are anthropogenic in orientation. This is the central site, and you can see how it links up according to, once again, basic cardinality to these two other major sites. This is another major site. We don't even know whether that spit, in fact, may be anthropogenic. They built it out into an extremely deep lake to link up with the major formal road leading into this structure. These are all contemporary villages. We know, based on archaeological evidence, that the same basic economy is in place. These folks concentrate about 80% of their diet is manioc. They have the same basic housing form. We have ceramics from archaeological deposits that are essentially identical in manufacture and use, wear, and decoration. The way that they were used, very closely related to manioc processing. That this was fundamentally a manioc economy, supplemented by the primary source of protein, which was fishing, as we find throughout most of the Amazon. And like Clark has very clearly has demonstrated from the Mohos, and people have found evidence in multiple different places in the Amazon, people could do all kinds of things to get fish out of the water from all different kinds of water bodies. So we see an extremely modified agricultural landscape. It's very different than the clear-cut patchwork landscape of modern agricultural development. It was a mosaic of overlapping systems in long rotational systems. One thing that the ancients did, which was a great boon to archaeologists, is they built large earthworks around and within settlements, and we can follow those pretty clearly. To make a map in 1992 and 1993 of one of these sites that's about 50 hectares in size, it took us about 4 months, cutting transects through the forest and using transect and compass and tape. Now, after selective availability was removed from GPS positioning, in 2001, we can map some of these villages in a matter of days, or at least a week. And so all of a sudden, we were able to map villages across a much broader area. These are some of the maps that were derived from the GPS. And here is a fascinating thing. This is a ceremonial center site that links to the north and the south two major residential sites. This is over 50 hectares in size of residential area. This is a slightly smaller one, but look at what these folks are up to. This is pretty complicated stuff. This kind of gets into the realm of the so-called geoglyphs and Nazca lines type of things. All of the major settlements had a primary formal path oriented basically to east and west at the summer solstice. This actually mapped out the sun path, or east and west, at the winter solstice. You can see that not only is east and west, but they have very clearly north and south and intercardinal directions. They have mapped out, almost like a protractor, all of these geometric principles on the landscape that are oriented to the way people move, the orientation of the body through the landscape. Here comes the fractal part. When you walk into a Shinguanu house, through the front door, through the front door, on your right is the owner of the house, the uneotu. On your left is the secondary owner of the house. Now, if you're a chief, you live in very special places. You live on the very southern or the very northern part of the village, which means if you walk in by the formal path, like this, on your right is the owner of the village, on your left is the secondary owner of the village, the first and second chief of these communities. We now know, because of massive depopulation post-1492, these basic principles and concepts had been boiled into the single village. We now know that at the regional level, they had a similar principle. One primary residential site, 50 hectares, or 10 times the size of the contemporary village, and another one that were linked up. Same basic principle. Then this was bisected, and you have two secondary walled villages. All of these are major walled settlements, significantly larger than contemporary settlements. The orientations of chiefly bodies, as I said, the basic orientation of the house of the chief, the owner of the house. Also, when the chief is buried, they are buried in a hammock that is constructed by digging two shafts and hanging a hammock through a shaft between those two vertical shafts. So the orientation of the chief is the exact same as when he is sleeping in his chief's house at the southern or northern orientation of the plaza. This then is spread across the landscape based on these similar principles. When we actually got all of the stuff mapped out across the landscape, the village locations, and we followed out the roadways and the directions, well, this is what we came up with. We have all of these roadways going east and west, and they probably continue out. These are the two primary clusters. They're about 250 square kilometers in size. Those are the individual polities. They also have this north-south dimension. So these basic orientations that are tied to the orientation of the human body and how that is expressed in built environment are spread across this entire forest. Not only is no part of this forest natural, but no part of this forest is not planned either. So you remember those lost cities you've been hearing about in the Amazon? Well, guess what? There's no stone centers, there's no pyramids, we're not going to find draft animals, there's no mines. But if we reorient our thinking around the number of human bodies that are involved, that are incorporated in this landscape, the degree of planning that goes into the orientation of those bodies, this is equally complicated as a wide variety of societies that are uniformly called urban. In fact, in reality, using a cultural evolutionary model preferred by many archaeologists, about 90% of the Grecian polis, the prototype of the city-state, wouldn't actually count as urban. And they're the size, or even smaller, of our favorite little walled towns in the upper Xingu. Across the region, we now have a documentation of the distribution of many of these walled settlements. We have 15. When you have a walled settlement, they never occur alone. That's the center of one of these polities, and it will have several satellites. The variation in how many satellites and how they're oriented, we don't know. But these white dots represent places where we actually have archaeological registration of those large walled settlements, i.e. an individual polity. You can see in our primary area of research how densely packed they are. So we put in these red circles as just an estimate of the possible distribution of these small-scale polities within a pure polity system. This pure polity system was distributed over an area the size of Belgium, or the size of the primary distribution of classic Grecian polis, and it incorporated at least 15. But the only reason we don't have white circles in these other areas is we haven't archaeologically tested there. So this has more to do with archaeological sampling than it does that there are actually gaps in the pure polity. There's probably more like 25 or 35 of these individual polities in the pure polity. Now we're starting to see what all the hype is about lost cities or ancient urbanism in the Amazon. We're starting to be able to see what some of these societies look like. Societies that were responsible for making these remarkable modifications of the landscape related to fisheries management and agricultural management, as Clark has demonstrated many times in the Bolivian Amazon, the terra pretas along the Amazon. This is a slightly different signature. But once again, we see here is a region within the broader and southern Amazon region of complex, relatively densely settled, and extremely hyper self-organized societies. Let me just... this, I guess, since it's such a mind blower, I should probably say something about it. The Kwikudu, when they use the land, there's a zone about 2.5 kilometers out of the village where you find multiple Kwikudu every day, men, women, and children, using actively the agricultural landscape. When you go out to about 5 kilometers, you see many Kwikudu every day. There's fewer women and children in that zone, more men out hunting. That's the active area. When you put that active area, which is the yellow and orange circles, over each of the individual settlements, you come up with this basic orientation. This is why I call this a saturated anthropological or anthropogenic landscape. There's really no part of it that's not under some form of active management, although that active management sometimes can be as conceptual or symbolic as it is economic. Oh, dear. We're starting to see, here is the orientation or a suggestion by climatologists and geologists of an Anthropocene that we've entered in about the past 250 years due to remarkable changes. One area in particular preceded that, which was the so-called denudation rate, the denuding of forests. Well, it turns out in the Bolivian Amazon, in Acre, along the Amazon River, in the Xingu, that around AD 1000, AD 1200, or 800 to 1,000 years ago, the Amazon was fully in stride with the rest of the planet in instigating or catalyzing this new transition of geological proportions in the world called the Anthropocene. And once again, has been mentioned many times again, the myth of the pristine forest is simply no longer tenable in this current world. And just in closing, I just want to remind us once again the important linkages in understanding social forests in the relationship between science and society. One of the people left out of many of the important debates, which is the question of voice, or what has been called the production of silence. You see, this is Mac Chapin's design, but doesn't this guy look a lot like my brother Fukaka? And they are systematically left out of the debate. Why? Because precisely they are primitives. But it turns out we can't sustain that viewpoint anymore, and so it's time to open the doors and welcome them in to the discussions that involve their lives. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions? That doesn't seem like that's on either, is it?
Project. I'm just curious what the John Terborgs of the world have as a reaction to this kind of clear data.
There's two forms. One is complete denial, and the other is just ignore. It doesn't exist. I don't exist. It's not worth talking about. Let's go back and read Betty Megger's Amazonia, Counterfeit Paradise one more time and convince ourselves that even though it was written many decades ago based on archaeological research done over 50 years ago, that that's the best that Amazonian archaeology can hope for in terms of science. Despite the fact, as Clark and I were just talking about today, there has been a remarkable increase in archaeological research throughout the Amazon. And there's certain basic things that we can all agree on. And one of those things is that variability, not uniformity, is as typical of cultural systems as it is ecological systems in the Amazon. So that means there's everything from small groups, formerly called primitive tribes or Stone Age savages frozen at the dawn of time, all of these classic images. There were indeed small-scale groups, probably very similar to some of the ones that we know today. But there was also some very large groups that covered very large regions that were integrated across large regions. And combined, you have a network of societies across the Amazon that, well, I think Clark and I both agree, there ain't no part of it that wasn't touched by human hands in one form or another. Even if it's the reorientation of birds that disperse seeds across broad distances, in some minor level, all parts of the Amazon are anthropogenic. So John Turbo, to answer your question, won't like it very much. Neither will Russ Mittermeier, I would imagine.
Liliana Davalos, SUNY Stony Brook, and the question is along the same lines, is what will it take for these kind of research to finally get to biologists? And I say this being a biologist myself and being in an ecology and evolution department and having all these colleagues that are just completely ignorant of any, the idea that these are completely, since the dawn of time, unperturbed, whatever, it just lives on. It's so persistent.
Well, it's remarkable, the persistence, and the persistence in the popular imagination, which in many respects is almost more dangerous than scientists talking amongst themselves. But the one slide that I didn't show about Bruno Latour describes two kind of ways to do work. One is a world of research, one is a world of science, or what Michael Gibbons in the European Union and his colleagues call Mode 1 and Mode 2 science. Mode 1 is disciplinary. You can agree on what the questions are, you can agree on the problems, you can agree on the instruments, and you can agree how to go out and use them. Problem is you can't talk to anyone in any other discipline because they have different questions, different methods, different tools, and different definitions of words as simple as like system or interaction. The other is Mode 2. And Mode 2 is based on resolving problems related to specific contexts of applications. It's transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, intercultural, multivocal. Anthropology is just kind of Mode 2 by definition. And the way we're going to answer these questions is we're going to get people sitting in a room with a Fukakakwikuru sitting at one side of the table, John Turbo, or at least somebody who's willing to listen to indigenous and anthropological voices and get these people working on it. Susanna and myself and Mark Bush and Bill Woods and Clark's work. Well, archaeologists are kind of herd animals. They have a hard time not being interdisciplinary. But it's these interdisciplinary dialogical communities where you get people, whether they agree or not, looking at the same problems. And the goal is not to come up with a solution necessarily. You may only define the dimensions of contestation, but you get people working on these things. And we're in this stage now. I've been working with paleoecologists and botanists and whatnot, going out. We know where the distributions are. We know one thing's for certain. This ain't natural forest because somebody had to get under there and build a road or plant those potsherds. Now we're going out with botanists and paleoecologists and looking at what's under them. And then the more conservative conservation biology types are going to have to take note of that biological stuff written in their Mode 1 disciplinary form.
Robin Chaston, University of Connecticut. I think that there is slowly a revolution happening in the conservation world, and among ecologists, there are a large number who are very cognizant of these large-scale, long-term human impacts in tropical forests. So we're not all like John Terborg, just want to encourage that. But I wanted to ask you, because when I cite these sorts of things in my papers, I get reviews back saying, well, it's not all been, occupied by humans. And if you could, so I dance around that a lot because I know that there's a resistance to the idea and to incorporating it into the research. But could you give us some kind of estimate of what fraction of the land area in this region that you're talking about would have been, deforested, or was it partially forested, or what kind of land use was it in? Just to put that in perspective with.
It's a difficult thing. One thing that I've kind of become less sanguine with over the course of the past 20 years is the idea that Amazonia exists anywhere except for in the Western imagination. That we created it, we put the definition on it, and there's so much variation there. It's like saying, can you define the anthropogenicity, or how much of the forest was denuded in, whereas our friend who presented on Europe, nobody would accept that. It's like, that's too darn complex. There's too many things going on. In North America, places we know better. There's an assumption of uniformity in Amazonia that we can get at that way. We can say in places like the Upper Xingu, in places like the Bolivian Amazon, where we have very good archaeological indications of large-scale transformations of the landscape, that much of the land was transformed from forest into something else. But as often as not, that was some other type of forest. One thing that we really have to be very clear about is these are not kind of the antecedents of chainsaw-wielding clear-cutters out there. There is nothing more foreign in the mind of the indigenous people that I work with than barren landscapes. Their great-grandfather was a jaguar. All of their important spirits, you just can't go into the forest and clear-cut it that way. So they had these remarkable mosaic landscapes. And I really am a sincere believer that if we really take these landscapes seriously, they're going to offer us extremely important clues for not only how to orient sustainable development in the Amazon, but how do we protect indigenous areas that constitute 20% of the Amazon and are the most important barrier to deforestation throughout most of the Amazon, and certainly in the southern Amazon. We don't need to only orient sustainable development outside these parks. How do you keep indigenous people from doing the bad practices from the outside, valorizing their indigenous practices?
I just had a quick question. To what degree is the knowledge that you're sharing with us present in the collective memory of the group, the indigenous groups that inhabit it today? Are you guys way outside of their working daily knowledge, or are they leading you? Kind of the relationship.
It's a mutual thing, and this is being one of the folks from the outside that's been adopted into the community. I take very seriously my relationship with them, formally adopted in a name-changing ceremony. But the chief of the Kwikuru, my adopted brother Fukaka, said to me once, he said, you know, something about your anthropology, this is the first time I ever understood anything about what you guys do. Or not what we do, but why we do it. Because he said, you know, people come and they study the language and they study the rituals, and I know all about this stuff, and I could never figure out, you know, where's the novelty here? This stuff you're doing, we never knew about that. They have a story for how these ancient villages were constructed, and it's an ancestor of theirs that constructed it. But it's just one step back from the ancestors that are 2 arms and 2 legs, and it scoured the ground. The chief, who was in mourning for much of the time I was doing archaeology, asked me to bring him out to the site after I'd been working there for about 6 months. And he said, okay, I'm going to tell you my story again, and then you've been out here for 6 months. You got a story to tell. I want to hear every detail. So I brought him along the roads, and I showed him where the plaza was, and I showed him where the trash middens were, where the houses were. He said, you know something? I like your story better. That makes a lot more sense to me. He said, but Fitsi, the culture hero, that one over there, he did that one. I'm still pretty sure of that. But you're right about this settlement. And so our knowledge, all of these places are the location of Terra Preta and other transformations of the landscape that the Kwikuru understand just like second nature. A young child knows where the Terra Pretas are distributed, so they bring the archaeologist along as an even younger child. But it's a mutual form. It's learning through doing and doing through learning. And the way they've adapted to understanding the GPS technologies, the mapping technologies, archaeological excavation, it's all been learning for them. They're now better archaeological mappers than I am, which isn't saying a lot, I suppose. But
Emmanuel Craig, Princeton University. In the context of the plea you were just making, and that's also in the context of the other presenters today and the many that will follow in the next 2 days, shouldn't we then abandon, if we set ourselves up against these old paradigms, shouldn't we then also not abandon the whole discourse, the whole language? If we keep talking in terms of deforestation, reforestation, we're still working within the paradigms that we are rejecting, because deforestation, reforestation, the forest is nature, is the origins, so we're still within this nature culture paradigm. So doesn't this mean that we have to reevaluate the very language that we use to set ourselves up against
Absolutely.
these
I
conventional?
prefer transformation of the landscape rather than deforestation or reforestation. However, in literal fact, they do deforest to create manioc fields. You can actually go out with them and chop down a tree if you'd like. There's very clear elements of that process that I think the old terminology. One thing that I really like about the Mode 1, Mode 2 distinction, traditional disciplinary knowledge production and kind of interdisciplinary, dialogic, more postmodern, if you will, knowledge production, is one doesn't eclipse the other. And as Fukakawa always says to me, he says, listen, I don't want you to tell us what we think about this stuff. I want to know precisely from what your science tells you as a specialist about this stuff, and then you can reinterpret it for us. And it's the same way I feel about the botanist. I don't want to retrain a botanist in how they become a botano-archaeo person, but for them to go out and do good botany. And then we'll talk about it on site and look at the stuff and see what resonances there are and build on that. And so I absolutely agree. It's going to collapse some of the traditional boundaries, but by the same token, in other areas, it has to remain business as usual. People going about the practices and the thoughts using the concepts that they're familiar with. I'm probably way out of time.
No, we should say that you are through now. And then
Thank you.
So, thank you.